All right, so we are live. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. This is going to be a wonderful morning. We have Dr. Jonathan Schorsch in the building again, and a lot of people requested for you to come back. A lot of people, we got a lot of feedback, and it's good to have someone who the audience loves, and they want to see this person again. All right. So
That,
first and foremost, Dr. Schorsch, we know who you are. You came on last week. You did a wonderful presentation of information and facts, and we want to continue this week with some unanswered questions. A few little questions left over from the last time. So we want to close the door on a lot of what ifs and questions we might have that never got answered by a professor before. So hopefully today we get to answer everybody's questions. And not that we're going to throw you away after today, but hopefully when you're free again, because if it wasn't for COVID, probably you wouldn't be free. You probably would be busy in a classroom right now. So and by the way, how are you doing today? I forgot to ask you that at the beginning. How are you doing?
Garfield, thank you. I am doing very, very well, and I hope you are too. Picking up from what you said before, it's always nice to be loved. So I'm honored, flattered, and delighted that people enjoyed our talk last week. Happy to do it again. I think even if it weren't COVID, I would have made time for this. I didn't get to say this last week, but I was honored to be with you for Black History Month, and I know now it's past Black History Month, but every month is Black History Month, or should be. So I'm happy to be with you again.
All right. Definitely, definitely. I appreciate it too. Um, One of the things that we talked about last week, there was a question I asked about the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews having a difference of opinions as far
Right.
as how they deal with, I don't know if it's whether how they deal with Judaism but they had like a conflict. Would you would you consider the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi Jews pretty much the same people but different geographic locations cause them to be different? Meaning that if you move north, I don't know if you, well, I'm not too great with geography and maps, but moving northward in Europe, they intermarried with people, and the Sephardic were basically the Portuguese and the Spanish, and they intermixed with people who were, who were probably African, some people who were already there, and so forth. So, would you agree with the 2009, from a genetic point of view? They're saying that there was a New York Times article that said that they pretty much come from the same roots, but
Right.
they ended up in different locations and intermingled. But when they did their genetics, the DNA, it came out to be the same people. What do you
Yeah.
say?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good summary of it. In other words, originally, well, not originally, but early on, you have the center of the Jewish population in the Middle East, uh, Palestine a little bit, but mostly in Persia, but Arabia, Egypt. There were many in Syria, many Jewish populations across the Middle East and North Africa. And then as you get into the ninth century, 10th century, you have the center of Jewish existence really moving westward into Europe. Uh, so, while there were Jews in Europe in Roman times, once you get into the early Middle Ages, the ninth, 10th centuries, 11th centuries, you have more and more Jews coming to Europe for economic reasons, among others. Some go to, and there are, by the way, there were Jewish communities in Italy and Greece. The communities in Greece go back to, again, Greek Roman times. And in fact, the Greek Jews consider themselves neither Sephardic and Ashkenazic, which is true of the Italian Jews. The Italian Jews consider themselves, they're very proud because they're neither Ashkenazic nor Sephardic. So the Jews who end up in what becomes later Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, obviously intermarry insofar as they intermarry with local people. Spanish becomes the language Spanish is a spoken language. So these are Jews who end up speaking Spanish, or although, obviously the Muslims had conquered much of the Iberian Peninsula, so many of these Jews probably spoke Arabic also, or beforehand spoke Arabic. So they spoke Spanish. They married people who were, Iberians, from Catalonia, or from Castile, or from Portugal. The Ashkenazic Jews are the Jews who move into southern Germany, parts of France, Provence, then Paris a little later. They moved to England. They moved to different parts of Central and Western and Eastern Europe. And they intermarry, again, insofar as they intermarry with local people, or local people convert to Judaism. And, so these are Jews who are speaking, let's say, forms of German, of French, or whatever local languages you have, and they are influenced by the local cultures, differently than the Spanish and Portuguese Jews are influenced by their local cultures. So biologically, historically, they're the same people. They start to diverge. They start to split apart a little bit around the 11th through the 14th, 15th centuries. Because they're living in different locations, they continue to have interaction with each other. Scholars continue to go back and forth, learn from one another. I think they're intermarrying with one another, but their customs and practices start to become a little different. There are different kinds of interpretations of different practices, different customs, different interpretations of some of the different texts. And then by the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, once the Jews are expelled in 1492 from Spain, and then the conversos, the descendants of the conversos, or the new Christians, they start to flee from Spain and Portugal. And then when they start to encounter Ashkenazic Jews again, now in the 16th, 17th centuries, now there's really a lot of differences between the two populations. Again, in terms of customs, practices, they're speaking different languages aside from Hebrew, which they have in common, but Hebrew isn't really a spoken language. Hebrew is a liturgical language. And as I mentioned last week, then now you have this kind of Sephardic arrogance where they won't intermarry with Ashkenazim, and they won't intermarry with anyone, actually. They're very they stick to themselves. They're very proud, and rightfully so in some ways, because Spain and Portugal really, until that time, was the absolute center of the Jewish world since the Middle Ages. The Spanish and Portuguese Jews were super proud of their being like the most advanced Jewish culture, the most advanced Jewish civilization, and numerically they were the strongest, largest Jewish population in the world, from, again, let's say the 12th century till the 15th century. So yeah, they kind of look down on Ashkenazim. So, but biologically, they really, again, come from the same roots. Yes, by the time you get to the 16th, 17th centuries and later, because they've maintained kind of separate worlds and separate communities. Like, we have to remember, even in cities where there were both Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews, they had different synagogues. They had separate synagogues already by this point. So they're starting to, they might look different. I'm not a geneticist, so I don't know if ethnically speaking they're becoming different, but they might be looking different. But again, the real difference is one of culture, language, and customs and practice. I hope that makes some sense.
Right. A question by a brother by the name of Brother Reggie in the community. He had asked the last time, I didn't get to ask this because we were rushing, how important is the Hatafat Dambrit in Jewish conversion?
Sorry, say it again. The what?
How important is the Hatafat Dambrit?
Okay, right. Sorry, I just didn't understand the first time you read it. So, okay, that's an excellent question. And Hatafat Dam refers to this idea and law that when a circumcision is performed, there is supposed to be a drop of blood that is drawn. And it is a central part of the circumcision process and ceremony. And, from our perspective, it seems very primitive, perhaps very barbaric. I mean, circumcision itself obviously is an intense practice. I will say that Jews, if you're born Jewish, you're circumcised on the 8th day, right? That's what the Bible says in Genesis when Abraham, was first circumcised, Ishmael, his son, and his slave Eliezer, when they were circumcised, right? If you're born Jewish, it's on the 8th day, which, by the way, I guess is sounds a lot less painful than being circumcised when you're 2 years old or 13 years old or an adult. Although for adults nowadays, they generally use anesthesia. So you do have to draw a bit of blood, and I have not really looked into it. I suppose it's it's something we could talk about anthropologically. It makes the ceremony or the process real or authentic. I don't really know, honestly, why that's so important, I confess. I will tell you one interesting thing, which is, so, again, if we go back to the history of Jews owning slaves, until the rise of Atlantic slavery, the slavery of Africans in the Atlantic world, slaves in the old world came from many different backgrounds, right? Slaves were often Slavs, right, from the Caucasus Mountains. That's why we get the name slaves, because it comes from Slavic, right? Slaves came from parts of Africa, but Jews were often slaves. They were often enslaved. Any politically dominated group usually ended up being slaves. And from the Jewish perspective, slaves, we have to remember that in the old world, most slaves were domestic slaves, helped around the household or with the family business. And it didn't matter what background the slave came from. If the slave was legally made Jewish, was converted, and if a male then circumcised, then the slave was completely Jewish. So I have seen no evidence in the old world, in terms of throughout the Middle Ages into the 15th, even 16th centuries, I've seen no evidence of racism, meaning I don't see any evidence that, let's say, African slaves were treated any differently than slaves from the Caucasus Mountains in the Jewish communities I'm talking about, right? Because, first of all, because there were so few slaves, you had maybe a handful of slaves in any given community. So there was no reason to be racist, as it were. Now, all of this completely changes when you get to Atlantic world slavery, right? Now, if you talk about places like Jamaica or Suriname, almost all the slaves were from one particular place. They were all Africans, right? They were all Black from the white perspective. And the ratios of Blacks to whites was incredible. Like in Jamaica and Suriname, you had maybe like 35 Blacks to every one white, right? 19 Blacks, 42 Blacks. I don't know exactly what the statistics were in each colony, but so the whites were, of course, outnumbered. They were terrified, and racism really, I think, arose in part because of those fears, because of that very clear difference between the dominating group and the dominated group. So when we're talking about Jews as slave owners in the New World, and there were, as we talked about it last week, there were Jews who owned plantations, there were Jews who owned slaves, whether in the cities or on plantations. And so we do have there's one rabbi in the 17th century who actually does issue a ruling that when it comes to the slaves belonging to Jews in the Americas, since many of these slaves come from African peoples who do circumcision, And therefore the slaves arrive, if they're adults or young adults, they arrive circumcised. What the Jewish masters have to do to fully convert their slaves is only do this hatafat hadam. All they have to do is draw the drop of blood, because the rest of the circumcision was performed, in an African manner, according to whichever people it is, the Fan, the Ashante, the et cetera, et cetera. And therefore you could consider them circumcised, but in order to complete the circumcision, masters should do this drawing of the one drop of blood. So it's to me, that's what a fascinating document is. One of the only, there are actually very few statements by rabbis about the realities of Atlantic world slavery. It's a very deep silence, and we can talk about why that's the case, but there is this one ruling, and what it tells me is, one, it tells me that a lot of the slave masters, the Jewish masters or slave owners, I guess masters sounds terrible, right, these days. So the slave owners, the Jewish slave owners, some of them were clearly circumcising their slaves, or concerned about circumcising their male slaves. On the other hand, I think what the rabbi is suggesting in his ruling is, we can accept African forms of circumcision. You just need to complete it with this one Jewish element, right? So I find that fascinating. Now we have no idea whether Jewish slave owners, in fact, to what degree they did or did not circumcise slaves. I argue in my research, what I've concluded is that, in fact, by the time you get to New World slavery, the 17th, but certainly the 18th century, that most Jewish owners are not circumcising their slaves. It's easier to just treat your slaves as outsiders, to keep them outsiders. You deal with your slaves according to the civic law of the colony, not according to Jewish law. And that, to me, is a big difference, because in the old world, right, Europe, the Middle East, et cetera, up until, again, 15th, 16th centuries, it was very different. And I that is one piece of evidence for me that the reaction of Jews to slavery in the Atlantic world, in the Americas and the American colonies, was partially racialist, because now you had so many slaves, so many Africans, enslaved Africans, right? There was more inclination of the Jews to keep the slaves out. And that's new, because according to Jewish law, there are different opinions, but if you look at the Talmud, according to Jewish law, a slave owner, and again, keep in mind that for the most part, we're talking about people who own 1, 2, maybe 3 slaves if they're wealthy, right? Back in the old world. A slave owner was supposed to convert their slave. You were not allowed to keep a slave in your household for more than 12 months, according to the majority opinion, because you wanted the slave to be able to help in the kitchen, for instance. And in order to prepare kosher food, the slave had to be partially Jewish. And also, we have to keep in mind, and this is not just true of Jews, slavery was really a kind of gateway into the family, into the community. Slaves were kind of in a liminal position. Slaves were like on a borderline. They were partial insiders and partial outsiders. And slavery, among many other things we can say about slavery, slavery was a way that many groups brought in new numbers, new bodies, right? Strengthened their own numbers. And that was very typical. That's typical in Africa, right? Where people come from different peoples as slaves, and then they become part of their host adopted sort of community, right? And that was true for Jews too. So you could not keep a non-Jewish slave, because then they would be really an outsider. You wanted to make them part of the community. So again, you were talking, Garfield, last week about Judaism as a missionizing religion, and that's another part of it. That's another evidence for it, that slaves were very, from the Jewish perspective, gladly brought into the community, because then it strengthened your numbers. It strengthened the number of Jews you had. So the fact that in the Americas, in the American colonies, Sephardic Jews mostly, but Jews who owned slaves were stopping to circumcise slaves, tells me that there was a reluctance to bring them into the community. And that I think had to do with racism, or at least racialism. So sorry, I know that was, like a lot of my answers are long-winded, but hopefully I'm able to clarify.
Yeah, but also if they were black, why would they have a problem with bringing them in? Showing again the Sephardic were different. They weren't the same as the people who were being enslaved. So if the Sephardic Jews were black people who were sub-Saharan African, why are you enslaving your own people? So you're both people then. You're the chosen and the wicked. It's craziness. But
it doesn't make
Dr.
sense.
Schorsch, someone just emailed me a question. My brother from London, England, Masi Zongo. Could you please ask Dr. Schorsch to tell us about the activities of Antonio Nunez da Costa and his brothers Manuel Batista Perez and João Batista Perez from Senegambia to South America? Are you familiar with those people?
Yeah, some of them more than others, but Manuel Bautista Perez was a converso of Portuguese background, and as we talked about last week, many of the slave traders in the Spanish Empire were Portuguese, and many of those were conversos. And Manuel Batista Perez, who operated out of Lima, if I remember correctly, in what was then called Nueva Granada, New Granada, now obviously Peru. And he was really one of the most prominent slave traders in that region. We're talking the early 17th century. And he did not so much bring slaves across the Atlantic, although he did that, but he mostly traded them inland, within the colony. But he was part of a network of slave traders, again, many of whom were Portuguese conversos. And again, converso, I think, is a better word than New Christian, which is the word I was using last week. But converso, again, refers to their coming from families, coming from backgrounds which were forcibly converted to Catholicism, starting in 1391 and thereafter, or who voluntarily converted to Catholicism because of social pressures or ambition. So Perez and da Costa, and there were others, who were really very active slave traders. Now, the question is, were they Jewish? And that's really remains a huge question. The Iberian scholarship, Spanish and Portuguese scholars from the 19th century on generally assumed that all of the, anyone who was persecuted or prosecuted by the Inquisition, they were Jewish. They were definitely Jewish. The Inquisition was a righteous institution, and it accurately identified conversos as being secret Jews. Now part of that attitude is a little bit anti-Semitic. From a Jewish perspective, the Inquisition is a very, very problematic institution. There's a debate among Jewish scholars over whether conversos are Jewish or not. And as I said last week, I think, we have to understand that, or I think we have to understand that among the conversos, there were many who were secretly loyal to Judaism. There were many who probably were actually loyal to Catholicism and were very happy to be Catholics. There was probably a group that uh, did a kind of mixture of Judaism and Catholicism, had some kind of idiosyncratic personal symbiosis or mixture of the two. And then there was a group that probably was just fed up with religion, because they, from a certain perspective, all of these religions were deeply problematic, and orthodoxy can be very oppressive, all kinds of orthodoxies. So there was definitely a group of conversos that was very skeptical, very free thinking, and very fascinating. So it's really hard to generalize. Now, this is the problem that I have pointed out in my in an essay that I wrote. I don't know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, on on converso slave traders. A lot of Jewish scholars say that the Portuguese conversos were much more loyal to Judaism than the Spanish conversos. Why? Because, as I said last week, the Portuguese Jewish community was converted entirely en masse in one group, all together in 1497 by the Portuguese king. They were forced to convert. They weren't allowed to flee. And if they didn't convert, they were killed. So you have this weird, bizarre, surreal situation where the entire Portuguese Jewish community is made suddenly Catholic, right, overnight. And so therefore, and then, as I said, the Portuguese king said, I'm not going to open an inquisition in Portugal for 40 years. So I'm giving these new Catholics, I'm giving you a grace period of 40 years. So that allowed this Portuguese converso population to really keep living as Jews for 40 years without an inquisition. So many Jewish scholars say that the Portuguese conversos are much more loyal to Judaism in secret than the Spanish conversos. The problem is, whenever you talk to Jewish scholars, most Jewish scholars, about slavery and slave trading, then suddenly they all say, oh, but none of these converso slave traders, we don't know that they're Jewish. You can't really prove that they're Jewish. So what I've tried to say is, well, you can't have it both ways. If many scholars think the Portuguese conversos were much more loyal to Judaism than Spanish conversos, you can't then turn around and say all of these Portuguese converso slave traders might not have been Jewish. So, to me, this is a very painful and tragic episode. And it's probable that many of these slave traders were Jewish to some degree or other, were loyal to Judaism, whatever that meant to them. And it shouldn't be a surprise, right? Why? You have a lot of the Christian slave traders were also devout Protestants or devout Catholics, right? That's the way things were back then, where people could be believing Christians or believing Jews and still have this sense that there's a hierarchy of humans, and some are superior to others, and some were cursed or destined to be slaves, and et cetera, et cetera. So unfortunately, a lot of supposedly pious Christians were racist. So it shouldn't be a surprise that a lot of the conversos of these converso slave traders could very well have been Jewish, loyally Jewish, pious Jews. But it does remain a kind of question, because I don't know that you can generalize. For a lot of these conversos, they worked super hard to assimilate into, to be accepted by Catholic society. They tried super hard to erase their Jewish background, to fit in, to be more Christian than the Christians, So again, I'm always wary of generalizing, but hopefully that does answer the question about some of those converso individuals. There are, by the way, some books about each of them. There's a few books about Manuel Bautista Perez, because he was such a well-known figure, and the transatlantic connections that the conversos have. We have to remember that, by the way, that in the 16th and 17th centuries, but particularly the 16th century, the conversos were actually quite prominent, quite dominating in the transatlantic economy and commerce, even though the conversos never had their own empire and they never had their own territory. They never had their own military. They didn't really have the same kind of shipping force that some of these other countries had. They were actually real players in the game. So they traded sugar, they traded indigo, they traded wheat, coffee, etc. And they traded slaves. So none of this really should be surprising. But again, from a Jewish perspective, personally, I mean, it's troubling to me. It's painful, but we can't impose our 20th and 21st century values on the past. I can wish that they would have behaved differently and better, but that's what it was.
All right. Thank you. Anthony Harris is asking in the chat, is it honest to say that Africans began to identify with Judaism through conversion in the 16th century and developed their oral traditions through the many years?
It's honest, but I don't think it's the complete truth. It's part of the truth. It's a good part of the truth. So as I was saying last week, when the Portuguese conversos end up coming to West Africa in the 15th, but really the 16th centuries, marrying local women, engaging in commerce with their African partners, having kids who are now, mixed white, black, mixed race individuals. So yes, they convert. Many of these individuals convert. A lot of the women convert or are converted. The kids are converted. If they're slaves, they're converted. We don't know if in every case, but we can assume that in many cases. But again, as we also said last week, there's no doubt that there were Jewish groups in Africa. We don't know how many. We don't know how large they were. We probably don't know where all of them were. We've talked about places like Timbuktu. There were Berber Jews throughout the Maghreb, right, North Africa. In fact, there was a Berber queen who was very well-known, Kahena, in the 8th century, maybe 6th century. I forget the exact date, forgive me. So, there was a lot of intermingling going on. So there were probably, again, we have to be careful about these terms, African and Black, right? But there's no doubt that there were sub-Saharan African individuals, Black individuals who entered the Jewish communities long before the 15th or 16th century, going back to Judea itself. And we have, the Bible is evidence of it. The Cushite servant, the runner to King David, among other examples. So clearly there were individuals who come from Africa or are considered Black in our modern terms, but it's not large numbers, I would say. We have, again, I mentioned last week the Jews of Cochin, right? There's a whole group of freed slaves, manumitted slaves, who are called the Black Jews by the other Cochini Jews, and they're not accepted. They're not allowed. You can't marry with them. You can't even buy meat from them because it's not clear if they really keep the laws of keeping kosher. You're not allowed to go to their synagogues, and their Blackness was actually part of the issue, part of the problem, I have no doubt. And why were they Black? Because they were, I assume they were of African descent, of sub-Saharan African descent. And there actually the numbers were fairly high. They actually formed their own communities. They had multiple synagogues in and around Cochin. So, but that's a little later. That's, again, the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. So, in other words, there were many ways that Blacks, from our modern perspective, people we would call Black, came into the Jewish community. So, again, I hope that makes some sense of it.
All right. I got a question again from London, England. I think you answered this last week. Some claim African Americans descend from the Portuguese Jews. Can you, he worded it wrong, but are African Americans descendants of Portuguese Jews?
All African Americans?
Yes.
No. I mean, how could they be? You have slaves brought from many points in Africa, West Africa, all along the western coast of Africa. I mean, later on, obviously, from the eastern coast, even from Madagascar. I mean, but they're not all Jews. They're Africans. They're, again, they come from multiple backgrounds. So no, I mean, and as we talked about last week, I mean, I can't think of, other than one or two or maybe a handful of exceptions, I can't think of any slaves brought across the Atlantic who claim Jewishness uh, until Equiano, that's the 18th century. So again, I talked about Esperanza Rodriguez last week, so that's one exception I know about. She'd been a slave in Seville, in Spain, Sevilla. But yeah, I would say, so therefore, like 99.9% of the slaves have nothing to do with Judaism. You start to have slaves converted to Judaism in the Americas, in Suriname, in Jamaica, in Dutch Brazil. And by the way, I should say, going back to the question of one of the brothers from I forget, from London, or whether it was Brother Reggie, but when it comes to circumcision in Dutch Brazil, we know that there was an ordinance passed in the Jewish community in 1640s. Right, the Dutch controlled 4 provinces of Brazil from about 1621, but definitely from 1630 to 1654. So a very short time, not even a half century. And when the Dutch controlled those areas, the Dutch were very friendly with the Jews. They cooperated a lot with the Jews. They were very happy to have Jews come to Holland and come to the Dutch colonies. And the Jews lived openly in Dutch Brazil, which of course they could not in Portuguese Brazil because of the Inquisition and because the Catholics hated the Jews. And so there's a community ordinance from the Jewish community of Recife in Brazil. And it says that Jewish owners should not circumcise their slaves until they are freed, until they're manumitted. Why? Because once the slave is circumcised, according to Jewish law, they are then really partially Jewish. If you've done the ritual immersion and then you freed them, then they're fully Jewish. So once you circumcise a slave, they are really part of your community. You're not supposed to sell them. You can't treat them like a slave, ironically, right? Again, the paradoxes of all of this material and these laws, right? And these attitudes. Once you circumcise a slave, they are part of your community and household. You can't treat them like they're not human by selling them off, right? And so this piece of legislation from 1640s Brazil tells us, again, many things. One, it tells us that Jewish owners were circumcising their slaves, at least some of them, which, and do we consider that positive or negative? Is that a problem or is it good? Who knows? It depends on who you ask and what your perspective is, right? So they're circumcising some of their male slaves, or some of them are circumcising some of their male slaves. But then it obviously is clear that some of them are still selling their slaves. So that's bizarre, right? Like, on the one hand, they're bringing them into the Jewish community, or they're following Jewish law to some degree, but then they're selling them as if circumcision in Jewish law doesn't really make these slaves one of us, right? So that to me is very troubling, right? And I would assume that one of the reasons the law was passed in Brazil, in Recife, was to say, look, if you free your slave, then you can make that slave fully Jewish. And then that's the time to circumcise the slave. And by the way, I want to make it clear that once the slave is free, and even while the slave is still a slave, circumcision is never enforced. The circumcision and the conversion to Judaism was always supposed to be voluntary. The slave had to want to become a Jew. The slave had to agree to it. And if the slave didn't, then you sold the slave. Again, by 12 months, according to Rabbi Akiva, according to Talmudic law. So the slave was given the choice, and you could not force the slave to be Jewish, to become Jewish. So this law from 1640s Brazil says, look, you can't mistreat your slave once you bring them partially or fully into the Jewish community. And so here too, we're faced with the complexity of how to interpret these kinds of laws. Is this law protecting slaves? is it actually treating them humanely by saying that they can only be converted after they're freed when it's voluntary? And is it protecting them from being sold even though they've been partially brought into the Jewish community? So you could read it that way. And you could also read it the opposite way. You could read it as saying, look, we just don't want to make slaves Jewish. So just don't circumcise them, because we know, the people writing the law, we know that most of the people actually don't free their slaves, right? Overwhelmingly, owners did not free their slaves, right? We know that of Christian owners, Protestant owners, Catholic owners, Jewish owners. The overwhelming number of slaves were not freed, and those who were freed as a kind of, you know, gift of beneficence, right? So maybe they passed the law knowing that most of the freed slaves, that few slaves would be freed, and that even among the freed slaves, most of them wouldn't convert to Judaism. So it could be seen as a law that keeps Africans out of the Jewish community. So once more, it's one thing to have the evidence, and then it's another thing to know what to make of it. So, yeah.
All right. Someone made a comment. You know what? I'm not even going to go there with that. I'm going to leave that one alone. I'm going to leave that one. You have a book.
Send it to me afterwards so I can see what I was spared.
No. He actually said that the Portuguese never brought slaves to North America. The British, Spanish, and Dutch took the slaves from Portugal and brought them to Brazil and Caribbean, and they brought slaves up to North from South America and Caribbean. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing to disagree with about that. Can you talk a little bit about, there was a gentleman by the name of Billy Simon, and he claimed he was a Rechabite, and he was in the South, right? No one really knows. And I had an email with Ralph Melnick, because he was like the expert about Billy Simon. And me and him was emailing this week. And for some reason, I woke up and thought about it. And I found out that the Rechabites, the claim to be Rechabites, is connected to Arabs and Muslims. There's a lot of people in the Muslim community in North Africa, especially, or even Madagascar, who would claim that they are Rechabites. Because to me, I'm not disrespecting anybody who claimed to be a Rechabite, but I don't see a reason to claim to be a Rechabite. I really don't. Mm-hmm. So to me, I think it's a genuine tradition of him. He said his father told him he was a Rechabite. He never said he was a tribe of Judah. He never said he was a tribe of Simeon or whatever tribe. He said, my father said we came from the Rechabites, which is what most Muslims who hold to Abraham and so forth, they would claim being a Rechabite. What do you think about the whole Billy Simon in conversation?
Yeah, I mean, a fascinating example. I don't know so much about it. I mean, I've read, some of what was written about it. I did not remember that he claimed to be a Rechabite. Who knows? Who knows? There's so many things in history that we know so little about, or that we think are real, or we think are not real, but then find out it's the opposite. So who am I to say this could not have happened, or it's impossible? Sure. So maybe there were Rechabites. Maybe indeed it was, as you say, a tradition that actually went back centuries, back to Rahab, the prostitute from the time of Joshua. Again, who am I to say? I think that I'm torn, because there's different impulses, right? One impulse is to validate and respect people's oral traditions. If this is what the Lakota say, or if this is what, the people from Fiji say about their own past, if this is what the Lemba say about their own past, that they walked across Africa, that they came from Yemen. So who are we to doubt it? Why should we doubt it, right? This was oral history, oral tradition passed down through the centuries, just like with the griots, of West Africa. They knew their stuff. Hopefully they knew their own history and past and identity. On the other hand, there's an opposite skeptical tendency, which is to say, well, this is the realm of myth. And people say all kinds of things, among Jews, it was always common, not always, it was, common in the medieval and the early modern period to produce genealogies of your own family. And of course, everyone descended from King David. Um, so, is that just wishful thinking? So now we're kind of operating in the realm of myth. People want to believe certain things because it gives them status or it makes them feel better. It connects them with something that's important to them. So who am I don't really want to say yes or no, it's impossible, it's possible, or it was definite. It's another area where we have to, well, we don't have to, but I think it makes sense to simply be humble and say, we're not sure. It could be, and then to me, once more, the question is then what do you do with that? So was Billy Simon, did that make him Jewish before he converted to Judaism? I don't know. Is he a rare example? Is he such a rare example that it doesn't really matter because there was no one else like him? Is he a rare example that points to the possibility that there were others like him? All of those things are possible. And I wouldn't want to say anything more than we would, from a scholarly perspective, I would like to have more evidence to be able to say more. I would like to know more about what that meant to him, more about, did he know about his ancestry in terms of their Jewishness? I know that he was welcomed. I remember that he was welcomed into the community, and he was apparently sort of beloved and part of the community. So, as always, I think some people, for some people, I think proving your origin biologically is more important than for other people, So some people want to feel that their blood, blood is such an important thing. It's not just a metaphor. They want to know that they really and truly come from this people, come from this place, descend from this guy or that woman, And for other people, their identity is, it's, I don't know, I'm tempted to quote, Eric B. and Rakim, it ain't where you're from, it's where you're at. And so in other words, what do you know about where you come from? What's important is where you're at today, and I don't know. So yeah, so again, I'm ambivalent about some of these questions.
I was going through your book. You have a book that you edited. It's called The Sephardic Atlantic, for those who are not familiar with it. And I don't think people realize how important your work is, because a lot of people like to cover what the Sephardic Jews did and what you've stated several times how horrific slavery was and the treatment of African slaves. You talked about an argument in academia where folks are trying to lessen the role of what Sephardics did. And if I'm wrong, just correct me. Try to lessen the roles of what Sephardic did and you're holding them accountable in this writing because I'm reading the first chapter, the part 1, and I'm like, wow, Jonathan Short is going in. I'm like, he's going in here. And a lot of people, and I'm gonna say this to the people in my community, a lot of the information we use comes from you, Jews in the modern world, but you have other works that you're actually going in because you're not proud of what some of your ancestors did as far as slavery. Can you talk about this for a little bit?
Yeah, listen, I appreciate the way you summarize that. I am truly honored and happy if my work can be helpful to people. When my first book came out, the one you have referred to a number of times, Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World, my wife said to me, she was like, you are going to be public enemy number 1 in the Jewish community, because I feel it is my scholarly duty and I wear this not just because I like the fashion, but for a reason. So I try to walk with God, and honesty obviously is one of the divine virtues, um, and truth telling and truthfulness. So I try to call it as I see it, and I try to follow truth where it leads me. So I think a lot of Jews don't like what I'm saying because some of it's harsh, and I am trying to hold Jews accountable and say, yeah, this is what some Jews did in the past, and we have to own it. It doesn't mean we're guilty. I'm not guilty of it, but I'm responsible for how I deal with it now in the present, And then on the other hand, a lot of Black folks don't love what I do. I mean, I haven't read it because I don't really feel the need to, but I've been attacked a lot by, different Black nationalist, Nation of Islam people, because I'm, just another kind of white erasing, white participation in the slave trade. So you can't please everybody, but that's okay with me. I try to be honest to myself. So yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is hold Jews accountable where I feel it's necessary and important and valuable now, today, and not overlook it, not pretend otherwise. A lot of Jews, and I really don't mean, I hope I'm not being misunderstood, because obviously a lot of what we're talking about, Garfield, you and I today, is super controversial and super sensitive, right? So I try to just speak frankly and openly and hope that I won't be misunderstood. But, what I was going to say before, a lot of Jews like to feel that they're Blacks' best friends. We've always been there for Blacks. We've been partners with the Blacks. We helped found the NAACP. We have all these connections with Blacks in the United States because of music, the blues, jazz, etc. And there's a lot of truth to that. There definitely is a lot of truth to that, but there's also a way of making yourself feel good, and making it, as we say now, whitewashing it, right? Making it seem better than it was. So in that sense, yes, I'm critical of certain Jewish scholars and a tendency to say, whoa, we weren't responsible for the slave trade. It was really the Christians. There's some truth in it, but that's not the whole truth. Jews were partially responsible. Jews were also partially responsible. Maybe we weren't as bad as the Christians, but all these words, bad, responsible, they're all so subjective. It always depends who you're talking to. It depends what you mean. It depends what kind of tone you're using. It depends what the consequences of it are. So, and then on the other side, yeah, I also am very critical of Black nationalists and Nation of Islam type people who are saying it's all the Jews' fault. It's the Jews started it, and the Jews ran the whole thing. So that's also not fully true. That's also an exaggeration, and I think it's a mean-spirited, ill-willed exaggeration. So for me, the truth is complicated and somewhere in the middle.
All right, let's go to, I think you touched on this a little bit last week, but they said to ask you, Mike, this is from Mike, could you ask him to talk a little about the Jews of Suriname and the mulatto class that they formed?
Great question, great topic, fascinating topic to me personally and to many people. So Suriname was a Dutch colony. First, it was an English colony. Before that, obviously, it was inhabited and ruled, I guess, by different Native American peoples. Suriname, as a Dutch colony, so we're starting about the 1660s. And they got independence quite late, actually, in the 20th century. I want to say in the 1940s, I think they finally gained their independence. 48, maybe? I forget. 72, actually. No, super late. I think it was crazy how late Suriname gained independence. But anyway, so the Sephardic Jews in particular started flocking there in the 1660s. As I said last week, Sephardic Jews mostly made up about a third of the white population, a third of the European population. And the Jews were really quite, not only numerically prominent, but culturally, economically, very, very prominent in Suriname. Suriname and Curacao, both Dutch colonies, which again goes back to this alliance really between the Jews and the Dutch. The Dutch were very welcoming to the Jews. In Suriname and Curacao, until from, let's say, again, the early 17th century until the late 18th century, those two colonies, Suriname and Curacao, were the wealthiest Jewish communities throughout the American hemisphere. They were basically Jewish success stories. And in fact, they were spoken about in Europe by both Christians and Jews as models, showing that Jews could be citizens, Jews could be part of our Christian societies, and see they can be productive, they can be respectable, they can do agriculture. And that's a whole other conversation, these stereotypes against Jews. But anyway, so Suriname was a kind of model for a lot of European Christians and Jews alike. So the Jews owned at the peak by the mid 18th century, the Jews owned about 415 plantations. You can see maps of Suriname. The Dutch loved their science and cartography, so they did all these amazing, glorious maps that are really colorful and amazing to look at. And you can see the names of Jewish plantations. The Jews often gave their plantations names in Spanish, obviously, or Portuguese, because they were of Spanish-Portuguese background, gave them very kind of optimistic, utopian names like Esperanza, right, hope, which obviously from the perspective of the enslaved people who were forced to work there was ironic and paradoxical at best, cruel paradox. There were about, at most, we're talking about maybe 3,000 Jews, and I think that's probably even a high estimate. So the Jews owned, we don't know the numbers really, but I tried to calculate it in my first book, again, Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World. Let's say, and this is really, really a rough estimate, but let's say that over the course of the century and a half or 2 centuries where Jews were owning a lot of plantations and owning a lot of slaves. So owning a plantation in Suriname meant you might own 70 slaves, 120 slaves, maybe 200 something if it was a really huge, well-functioning plantation. Economically successful plantation. So let's say the Jews owned at 100,000 slaves total. I have no idea if that's really even close to accurate. 70,000, I just don't know, because we just don't have the numbers. You could literally count up, by the way, as again, if you look at my book, right, you can see that we have inventories still to this day in the archives of a lot of these plantations, right? So you can literally look and see what the property that was owned by these Sephardic owners was. They had this chandelier, they had nice table, they had nice silverware, and they owned, these blacks. This one was, Coromanti. This one was Ashante. This one was named Juba. You can literally see it in the inventory. So the remarkable evidence that I tried to make use of in my first book. So they owned lots of slaves. As I said before, I think most of the slaves were not converted to Judaism. Some of the slaves, especially the house slaves, the lighter skinned slaves, were converted to Judaism. We have evidence that, for instance, if I remember the dates correctly, in the 1720s and even earlier, that is still fairly early in the colony's history. We have evidence of Jewish weddings where the bride or the groom, or even both parties, were of African background and had been made Jewish. We know that these Black Jews or colored Jews who had been converted, again, whether legally or not is another question, but they participated in the life of the synagogue. They were probably given the Shabbat off, Sabbath off. We have evidence that supposedly some enslaved people preferred being in Jewish homes because then they would get both Sunday and Saturday off. I don't know if that's really true, but that was evidently the perception of some. And one of the places in Suriname that most of the Jews lived was a town called Jodensavan, which means literally Jews town. It was a town up in the interior, very far up, really pretty about as close as you could get to what was then still rainforest. In other words, what was still, quote unquote, wild territory. And that's where most of the Jews lived, in Jodensavan. And it was really this fascinating autonomous settlement where the Jews had a lot of autonomy and independence and ran their own affairs. And the slaves who were made Jewish were clearly part of that life. Clearly, we see it from all kinds of mentions in the different archival evidence. So we have a small population of mulatto Jews, colored Jews, whatever term we want to use. And I'd say, again, from my calculations in terms of the evidence I've seen, in the 18th century, I'd say at most, maybe there were 100 individuals, 200 individuals. Once again, I just have to say, these are all completely rough estimates. Could it have been 300? Could it have been only 100? We just don't know. But over the decades, over the generations, until abolition, we have this group. Early on, some of them were clearly participating in the Jewish community, the life of the community, the religious life, the ritual life. But as I said, there was a whole series of communal laws that were passed, which tried to keep them outside, right? Said, don't circumcise any non-whites. Anyone who marries a non-white Jew will lose their first-class status in the synagogue. There was a separate cemetery for non-white Jews, et cetera, et cetera. So it was clear that there was as always, as I said last week, there's always a double face when we're dealing with slavery and enslaved peoples from the dominating majority, or not even majority, the dominating group's perspective, right? So yes, these mulatto Jews were partially included, and yes, they were also partially tried to be kept out. In the mid-18th century, some of these mulatto Jews, who, by the way, were the children of some of the most prominent Sephardic plantation owners, right? Some of the most prominent Sephardic slave owners and members of the community. So they were partially in the family. Some of them were fully included in the family, treated as family members. I think there are even one or two cases where I've seen mulatto Jews who ran plantations. So go figure that. Again, nothing is, almost nothing surprises me anymore when it comes to history. And clearly mulatto Jews, just like mulattoes and mixed race Blacks who were not Jewish, they owned slaves too. And there still is a huge debate about whether they owned their slaves in order to free them or in order to protect them from white slave owners, or whether they were themselves not so kind to Blacks, full Blacks, a class that they considered often inferior to themselves. So the complexities are endless. So anyway, in the mid-18th century, some of these mulatto Jews were very unhappy with the way they were treated, and they actually agitated to form their own society, and it wasn't really their own congregation, it was really a house of study. The white Jewish leadership was horrified. They did not want this at all, which, although that's a little surprising, because partially I would have thought they would have liked that, because if they had all these issues with them, so why wouldn't they have liked there to be a separate society for the colored Jews? But for whatever reasons, they really opposed it. The mulatto Jews, again, some of whom were quite elite in their own right, went to the colonial authorities. The colonial authorities sided with the mulatto Jews. They said, yes, you can start your own house of study, your own sort of society. They did that. By the way, the Hebrew name for the society or the house of study, and by house of study, I mean, they studied Torah, they studied Jewish texts and Jewish tradition. So, they were into Jewishness. Into Judaism to some degree or other. The Hebrew name for their society was Yosher, basically meant piety and uprightness. And the Hebrew name itself was kind of a dig, was kind of a jab at the white elite Jews, right? Saying you are the elite Jews, you're the owners and the supposedly the real Jews, and look how you treat us. It's so unjust. It's not righteous. So in a way, they were kind of sending a message, right? Signaling, signifying toward the white Jews and saying, don't think you're so righteous. When it comes to the way you treat us, there's something really not kosher about the way you treat us. So they had this separate house of study, this brotherhood and of course it was for men only, right? Everyone was sexist back then. No one wanted women to do anything, right? That's a whole other story. So it lasted for a few years, for a few decades. I think around 1803, if I remember correctly, their building, they actually managed to raise the funds to build a building for themselves. Some of the monies came from some of the white Jews, right, who we have to keep in mind were related to these mulattoes, right? They were the fathers, they were the uncles, etc., right? So they had a building that they managed to build. It burnt down mysteriously around 1803. I have no idea whether it was arson or whether it was just an accident. All of the buildings back then were wood, and so fire was always a tremendous threat. But anyway, so their society kind of collapsed at the time. When you get into the 19th century, so we have to keep in mind in the 18th century, 17th, 18th centuries, a lot of these mulatto Jews, as I said, were kind of living this in-between existence. They were parts of the families, they were partially Jewish, they were allowed to participate in the community, and yet there was also these legal and attitudinal walls that were put up against full participation. When you get to the 19th century, ironically, in some ways, the colored Jews are treated better and they're allowed in much more. Why? Because in the 1870s and 1880s, there was a huge economic crisis in the colony, and Suriname kind of started to go downhill. And so the Jewish community started to go downhill also. And the Jewish community suffered economically tremendously. So I suspect that as their numbers started to dwindle, because a lot of the Jews then left and went back to Europe or to, let's say, what the United States, or was already the United States after 1776. So I think there was kind of more reason for them to let the colored Jews in because the community was so weak and vulnerable. At the same time, there were also ways that these colored Jews were really kept out of the community even more strongly. And so I apologize. I know it's very confusing, but there's always this kind of double face and almost a kind of schizophrenic attitude. So for instance, by the 19th century, the children of colored Jews were not raised Jewishly anymore. They were all raised as Protestants. And that was kind of something that was determined by the white, the leadership of the Jewish community. And they, I guess at a certain point, they sort of simply said, well, we're not going to educate them and raise them in Judaism anymore. So suddenly all of these children of colored Jews were now raised as sent away from the community, to Protestant missionary schools and other schools. So in Curacao, basically, and Curacao was not a plantation economy like Suriname, but Curacao Jews, Sephardic Jews mostly, also made up about a third of the European or white population. Jews also owned lots of slaves there, but here mostly as domestic slaves. There were a few plantations that were more like trophy plantations, the soil in Curacao kind of sucked, so agriculture was not so successful there. But in Curacao, the non-whites were basically completely excluded from the Jewish community. We don't have any communal laws that were passed because it was an unwritten thing that you simply did not circumcise slaves, you didn't immerse them in the ritual bath, you did not bring them into the community. So there are very, very few, literally a handful or so of non-white Jews until you get to the later 18th century and 19th century. And then in the 19th century, you start to have more colored Jews, most of whom are born not necessarily not necessarily from slaves, but from affairs, or again, whether they're really romantic and consensual or whether they're just rapes, I can't say, but relationships, sexual relationships with either free blacks or the slave woman who belongs to someone else or whatever, something like that. And then you have in the 19th century more kind of colored Jews who are partially within the families and so on. In Suriname, frequently even the Black Jews who were included in the families and treated as members of the families, usually they'd be given, I think I mentioned this last week, they'd be given a family name that was slightly altered, right? If your name was, Pereira, the name would be something like Fon Pereira, because there was another way of introducing some slight difference. Yes, you're a member of the family, but you're not really fully like us. So hopefully that kind of is a helpful overview. There are many descendants of these colored or mulatto Jews. I've met many of them here and there, and I don't want to generalize. Some of them are very Jewish. Some of them are not Jewish at all. Some of them are very resentful about the Jews. Some of them feel very included in the Jewish community. There is still a synagogue in Paramaribo, which is the capital of Suriname, still functions. It's very small. The community maybe 200 members at most, probably 50. I mean, it's really small. A lot of the Jews have moved to Israel and left the colony, the colony has not been doing so well economically. But the congregation is actually quite mixed. Really, at these days, very inclusive. Sort of like the congregation in Jamaica, by the way. It's a very diverse, these congregations are now very diverse. Whether they're making up for the past successfully or not, I won't say, but they are quite open these days. And then there was a last thing I wanted to say that, by the way, if you're interested in this whole topic, right, so there's a great map of the slave coast in Africa. So if you're interested in Suriname, there is, by the way, some wonderful, I talk about this in my book, Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World, but there is a lot of literature, scholarship on Suriname and the Maroons, right, the runaway slaves, the so-called bush Negroes, which is a whole other fascinating topic, including how these Maroons related to the Jews, and there's actually a lot of Maroon oral literature, a lot of Maroon legends and oral history, some of which talks about the Jewishness of some of the Maroons. Some of the Maroons continued to identify as descendants of this or that Sephardic plantation owner. So there's much more I could say about things in Suriname, but let's leave it at that for now, unless you have more specific questions.
All right, this is a map of the slave coast, and this is one of the claims that they make. A claim that you might not be able to make it out completely, but you're familiar with the Dahomey and it's called Wida or Fida or Judah. And what happened is a lot of folks in our community not a lot, a few are saying that the Judah, the Juda, is referring to Jews who descended to that region, and they call it Judah.
Right.
Can you go into
Could be
the Dahomey role in the slave trade and why? I don't know if you are familiar with the whole Wida, Fida, Judah name stuff, but
really peripherally. It's not really my area of expertise. As I said, Toby Green is the guy you want to talk to about that. He's done a lot of work on the conversos, on the lanzados in these areas of West or Central Africa along the coast. Judah, the name might come from the tribe of Judah. Why not? Who am I to say? I couldn't say it's impossible. Is it possible there were Jewish groups there even before, the conversos arrived? Sure, it's possible. but it's all hearsay. There's just no evidence. There's no written evidence. So it's just very difficult to say anything concrete about it. There's just unfortunately very little written material. So, a lot of it gets to be kind of legend and myth. Um, I don't want to say a lot of African Americans nowadays, a lot of Africans also claim Jewish background, not because an ancestor converted as a slave, or not because someone converted here in the United States or in Jamaica or whatever, but claim that they were Jewish back in Africa. So it's very possible that those claims are true in some cases. A lot of the people claiming Jewishness are not from Ethiopia, they're from West Africa. So I don't want to say it's impossible. Obviously, of course, it's possible. But again, there's just so little we know about that. What kind of Judaism did they practice? What did they know of Jewishness? Did they identify as Jewish back in Africa? Or is their claim of Jewish descent something that, as I was saying about Jews who claim descent in genealogies that they made in the Middle Ages, that they claim descent from King David, is this something that just gives you status? Is it something that makes you feel good? Is it something that helps you fit in with a Jewish community in Savannah, in Atlanta, in Charleston, in New York? So I don't want to sound too skeptical, and I certainly don't want to be erasing these kind of claims, because I would never want to do that. But I do think there are questions we have to ask ourselves. So I'm really not an expert on Dahomey, on Benin, and the specifics of whether Jews existed there or not. It's possible they existed there before the Conversos came. It's possible that some of the Conversos converted local Africans, local peoples, or some of the local peoples to Judaism. Yes, absolutely. But
Okay.
again, I just wish we had a lot more evidence and documentation to say things more concretely,
All right, let me go to a question from London, England again. You seem to be worldwide now. All right, please ask Dr. Schorsch. In the late 1400s, Portuguese kings sent Jewish kids to colonize Sao Tome.
Right.
Some African Americans are claiming these young Jewish kids were Black. Is there any evidence for this?
No, I would say, so I spoke about that last week. They sent about 2,000 youths who they kidnapped. They forced them to go to Sao Tome. And as I said again, as I said last week, I think it was an experiment to see whether whites could survive in the tropics, because tropical diseases were actually devastating to whites. Europeans who came to Africa, their mortality rate was very high because of diseases. And I think this was an attempt by the Portuguese king, I think it's Dom Manuel the First, if I remember correctly. There's the 1490s, if I remember correctly, to send these Jews there to see if they could survive in the tropics. There's no evidence they were Black. They were Jews. They were probably dark skinned. They looked like Portuguese, probably. They married with local women. I don't know if all the 2,000 youths were men. I assume there must have been girls among them, young women. So they intermarried with the local people on the island, and there arose a kind of class of mixed, again, mulattoes, mixed race individuals, and they actually came to dominate on the island. They actually became the dominating political power, precisely because politically and economically, they were the go-betweens between the white Europeans and the local Africans who dominated local commerce. And there's lots of discussion in the scholarship about whether these descendants of the Jewish settlers, whether they retained any sense of their own identity as Jews, whether they practiced anything Jewish or not. I think it's plausible to say that they might have a little bit for a while, for one generation, maybe even for two generations. But I feel like, and I'm not an expert on it, but from what I've read, I feel like it seems to me that that over a few generations, they lost their sense of Jewishness. They may have had a few customs, a few practices that were originally Jewish, but a lot of these people may not have even known that the practices were Jewish. So it's an interesting story. And by the way, the mulattoes, these mixed race people, they were the ones who dominated the slave trade. Just like in West Africa, right? In the Senegambia and Benin, Dahomey, right? The people who dominated the slave trade were precisely these mulattoes who were the mixture of the whites and the local Africans, whether they were converso or Catholic or, just good old Catholic. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. And by the way, I mean, the fact that if it's true that the Portuguese king sent them to see whether Europeans could survive in the tropics, that again tells you they're not African. It tells you they're not Black, right? Because,
wow.
Right? Because then it would have been obvious that they could survive there.
Right.
It's plausible that if they were Black, if they were African, then he sent them there because they could survive. I don't know. Again, I like to keep an open mind. The fact that they intermarried with these locals, and then the locals are called mulattoes and are known as a mixed race group, also tells you that one of their parents was not Black or sub-Saharan African. So we just over and over again, I have to just say there may have been individuals who were Black or sub-Saharan African who had entered the Jewish community over the centuries, but you just cannot call the entirety of any of these Jewish communities Black or African in the sense that I think your audience, your listeners are meaning it.
Okay. What role did Amsterdam play to the organizations of the Sephardic community in Senegambia?
In Senegambia, great question. Not a particularly strong one, actually. So most of the people who settled in Senegambia, most of the conversos were actually coming from Portugal. They were actually conversos who lived in, the Iberian Peninsula, and they came from there to West Africa. There were, by the 17th century, you have some and then what happens is when an individual converso or a converso family comes to, let's say, Amsterdam, and they become Jewish openly, and you could argue about whether they're coming back to Judaism or whether they're coming to Judaism for the first time. And there is a scholar, by the way, Joseph Kaplan, who uses the wonderful term "new Jews," that in certain ways, all of these conversos who were raised as Catholics, we can't really consider them Jews, because even if they had an identity that they thought they were Jewish, they considered themselves Jews, it didn't mean they knew anything about it. And they were also filled with Catholic anti-Jewish attitudes. So Kaplan calls them new Jews because they were really now becoming Jewish for the first time. Okay, that's a separate conversation. So when the conversos come to Amsterdam from Portugal, from Spain, what have you, then they're living now as open Jews, and then a bunch of them go back. They go down to Senegambia, to West Africa. There was, as I said last week, and as some of the literature talks about, there was one community or maybe two that was openly Jewish, where the people there, the whites, the European merchants or settlers were Jews who were living fully openly as Jews. And intriguingly, it was indeed, they actually gained protection from one of the local kings who actually stopped the Inquisition from coming, because he said, these people, whatever they are, they're Jews, but they are under my protection. And just like you Christians come and want me to protect you and give you rights to do commerce here, I'm protecting my Jews. They're my subjects. So fascinating. If you want the book to really look into for that is by Peter Mark and Jose de la Horta.
West African
And that's the West African Forgotten Diaspora.
Right, Forgotten Diaspora.
Which is a wonderful book. Wonderful, really, they brought up incredible evidence about these communities. But here too, I have to say, I'm much more critical and skeptical than they are. The evidence they have is very thin, very thin. So, but anyway, so Amsterdam's influence in West Africa was not really so official. There were different. There were lots of Sephardic merchants now coming from Amsterdam who we know conducted trade with West Africa, with Senegambia region, with Cabo Verde, Cape Verde, with Sao Tome even in some cases. We can see, again, we have the shipping records in the archives. You can look at them, see what they were trading, civet cat, gold, slaves, iron, whatever. And so merchants were definitely going back and forth from Amsterdam. And Amsterdam, of course, was one of the main centers of Sephardic trade in the Atlantic arena. But officially, I don't think the community was particularly involved. As always, when these merchants went to settle a new community, the Amsterdam synagogue, the Amsterdam leaders gave them a Torah scroll, gave them a book of the Torah to take with them. So they were very involved with kind of spreading, what's a good word for it? Like spawning new Jewish communities around the Atlantic and making sure they were Jewish religiously, right? And they followed the Torah, followed the Jewish law. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's, a good way to sum it up. I mean, obviously the Amsterdam elites, the merchants were very keen to pursue any economic opportunities, obviously, in order to make a living and thrive. So when the West African coast was very promising, so these Sephardic merchants were very happy to go there. We know that there were Sephardic merchants in Amsterdam who outfitted ships to trade with West Africa, hired Dutch captains, to trade with West Africa. Some of the Sephardic merchants went there themselves. We know of one or two cases where the Sephardic merchant would send their sons to West Africa. Some of them lived there for a while. We know of one case where one of the young Sephardic merchants got into trouble among the locals because of some kind of affair. I don't recall if he raped a woman or if there was questionable, behavior on his part, and he was actually, I forget if he was kicked out or censured, punished. But we have the evidence of that also in the Dutch archives. And that was the early 17th century, if I remember correctly. So there's definitely material there. And I mean, I'm sure that if you are an intrepid researcher, I'm sure that we'll turn up a lot more. As I said last week, there was a handful of Africans brought to Amsterdam by the Sephardic Jews. So there is a small population of in this case now really African Jews or Africans who have been brought into the community to one degree or other. And I wish we knew a lot more about them. I have tried to find evidence in the archives and they kind of disappear, unless you really know their names and can trace them in the archives. It's hard to follow them. So I would love to know much more about their children and grandchildren, whether they stay in the Jewish community or not. Whether they're accepted or not. We have the evidence we have is kind of thin, and I would love to find more. And I'm sure more will be found, over the, in the future. So if you're looking for a project and Dutch and Portuguese, please talk to me.
All right.
We will work together.
All right. I got a question from BLS. He's in the audience. In 2015, Spain and Portugal passed bills enabling descendants of exiled Sephardic Jews to acquire naturalized citizenship. Are you aware of any West African groups that's fitting the requirements of the bills passed in Spain and Portugal?
I can't think of any groups, but it would not surprise me if there are individuals who are applying. Uh, I mean, you have to fit certain criteria. It's apparently fairly, they're being kind of careful about it, apparently, what kind of evidence they're looking for and who they're admitting as who they're giving citizenship to. But it would not surprise me at all if there are people of mixed race descent who are applying for it. But groups, no, I can't think of any groups. Most of the groups in Africa who claim Jewishness now are claiming it very recently, and many of them aren't even claiming descent. They're just claiming religious affiliation, right? So the Abu Udaya, for instance, in Uganda, they don't claim to descend from Jews in ancient times. Their prophet Joseph, I can't remember his name. The founder of their community was a Christian, was a Protestant in the early 20th century who decided he loved the Old Testament and he loved the Hebrew Bible, and he made his family and his concubines and his extended household Jewish. So they're not claiming that they go back to ancient times. They're just saying, we now love Judaism. We are Jewish now. And from what I understand, and again, I'm not the person, Edith Bruder is one of the people you should invite. I don't know if you've talked to her. Well, William Miles.
Right. I invited Edith. She had to cancel because of some situation in France with the COVID stuff. So she got caught up. Yeah. So she was supposed to come on last Friday. Okay. I'm still trying to get her on because
William Miles is another one. So they would know much better than I. But from what I understand, a lot of the groups now that are cropping up, for instance, in Ghana, I've heard of some groups. In Nigeria, I know of some groups. And from what I understand, they're not claiming that they descend from Jews. They're claiming that they just, that they have discovered Judaism and that they love it and they want to be Jews. But yeah, I don't know of any groups that have applied or have been accepted to the Spanish Portuguese.
All right.
As Sephardim,
Another question from the UK. Yaya Negro, was he black or named after a conquered Black Moor village?
I don't know who that is. Sorry.
Okay.
If the questioner wants to identify the person more, I can. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know who that is.
Okay. All right. All right. Let me see if the audience has any questions for the doctor here. How important, you see, people like specific, they have their axe to grind. They like asking about people specifically. Myra Brankovic. Are you familiar with Myra Brankovic?
I mean, if I could get some more context, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. Let me see if there's any more questions. He had a question about Myra Brankovic, so I said, let me ask you if you know who that is before I even ask.
Who, what, where, when? Yeah.
Is the doctor familiar with the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, a boy converted to Christianity by the Catholic Church? Was Edgardo West African?
Wow, I have no idea. I mean, I know there's a book that was about that case. I have no idea if that person was West African. I know that in Italy, in the the early modern world, so in the 16th, 17th centuries, there are a handful of cases that I know about of African slaves belonging to Italian Jews, or actually better, I should say, belonging to Sephardic Jews who moved to Italy after 1492, right, when they were expelled, and a lot of the Sephardic Jews ended up in Italy. And so we have a few cases of slaves who converted, mostly women, who were owned by Sephardic Jews in Italy. There is a very fascinating case, I talk about it in my book, of a Black boy, a youth who is seen by some Catholic, prelate, some Catholic official in the church, and he's horrified. He's like, I think he even speaks to the boy, and he basically says, here you are, an outsider, you come to Europe, you could have become Christian. And, basically, excuse my language, what the hell did you do? Why did you become Jewish? Like, you had a chance to make it to the top and you made the wrong choice, buddy. So, and to me, that's a fascinating conversation, because, it tells you that, about Christian racism, right? And they're saying, oh, you became a Jew, but that means you didn't really make it as a full member of the club. And he's sort of horrified by it. And he clearly, I think, was trying to convert the young guy. So we know that, as I said, there were definitely individuals who were of African background. I don't know if it was actually West African. They could have been East African, right? Italy, we have to remember, got many of its slaves from Ethiopia because of its conquest, its connections, with Ethiopia. So anyway, there were definitely individuals who entered the Jewish community who were of, West African background, absolutely. Yeah. But Mortara, I have no idea if he was.
I think we talked about this last week. Somebody, Joby Fresh, is asking, were the first century Jews black?
I have to say no. I mean, they're not black in the sense that I think the person means it. They're not like, they don't look like West Africans. They're not sub-Saharan Africans. They're Middle Easterners. They're darker than Scandinavians. They are proud to be kind of swarthy and dark, but not too black and not too white in terms of their skin color. I don't think they have African practices or customs, unless you want to consider circumcision to be of Egyptian origin, African origin, right? Herodotus famously thinks that, talks about how the Ethiopians circumcise their male children. I don't. So what does it mean to call them black? What does it mean to call them African? If there's nothing African about what they're practicing and doing, or the way they're talking, how they see themselves, I don't know what it matters. And even if their skin color is dark, so again, it's always for me the question of, what do you mean by this? What are you trying to get at? What are you saying by this? What's your goal when you say that?
I think last week you talked about the boxwood. There was, I know in the Talmud they talked about a description of boxwood. Edith Bruder talked about a source that talked about the first white folks in Africa, or Jews in Africa, were white. She had some source that pointed that out in Taut, the community in Taut or Tamin.
Okay. Yeah. So that's much later. That's much later. Yeah.
But the boxwood reference is earlier. I think that was just a general reference of how they looked. Boxwood is like a light, fair, yellowish type of color, and
something like that.
I wouldn't consider that person to be black.
I would say it's more brownish, but the skin colors, it doesn't mean what skin color means in the 20th century US or 19th or 21st century US. So no, I would. And another way, by the way, you can tell is if you look, although this goes back a little further, if you look at Egyptian carvings, rock carvings, right? If you look at all of these hieroglyphics and all of these Egyptian, I don't even know what the right term for them is, all of these decorations and things that were carved into stone or whatever. If you look at Assyrian, Babylonian carvings and decorations, when they show Ethiopians, you can tell that they are, quote unquote, the term that I hate to use, Negroid, right? They have the flat noses, they have the kinky hair, right? When you look at the way Judeans are depicted, and again, it doesn't go back to ancient Egypt because they're not depicted in ancient Egypt, but if you look at how Judeans are depicted in Greek or Roman or Babylonian right decorations, they're not African. They're not African-like. So again, I don't know how solid that kind of evidence is, but I mean, the long and short of it is I'd have to say no.
All right. All right, we're wrapping up now, ladies and gentlemen. Somebody's asking, when did no, I'm not going to ask that. That's when did the Arabs convert to Judaism? No, I'm not. Nah, you don't
When
need
the
to.
Arabs convert to Judaism.
I
Wow.
don't know about all of that.
Not yet. No, I'm kidding.
Not yet, right? Ultimately.
No, that was before
Uh,
Muhammad. I mean, yeah, that was sixth century, 7th century. I mean, there were Jewish communities, apparently very powerful Jewish communities in Arabia.
yep, because when the Arabs took over, they had specific laws for how Jews could live within their system, either
Ex-
becoming dhimmis or what they could do. They could worship, but they can't put a temple that's bigger than the Arab temple, and
Exactly.
they did all that stuff. You have to pay a
Right,
specific tax,
right.
and but the thing is, though, all those references by the Arabs as Jews, again, African Americans are claiming that's them.
Right.
That's them.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Look, the Arabs, I mean, I don't know if you've ever talked on your show about the Arab slave trade. I mean, there was a whole slave trade from East Africa that was run entirely by Muslims,
Mhm.
and the Muslims, from what I know, and this is not my area of expertise, but the Muslims, contrary to Malcolm X, and what a lot of African Americans think, the Muslims in the Middle Ages were not, they were not so welcoming. They were pretty racist. They believed in the curse of Ham uh, in some ways, in some communities. They made fun of African slaves. They did not often want to allow their women to marry them, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, as I said, exploitation and oppression is unfortunately sometimes an equal opportunity thing.
All right. Let me see what else. Um, let me see. Let me see. YouTube monitors. Let me see. All right. Anybody else have any questions? I'm about to wrap it up in the next 5 to 10 minutes. I think Dr. Schorsch has given us enough time. I mean, we need to detoxify the pseudoisms that we've been running around with. And it's funny, people are using your book to prove that they are the real Jews. I find it so ironic. It's just crazy. They're using your book, quoting you to say, hey, he's talking about us. So what do you feel about that?
I find it ironic. I would say I'm happy to talk to people about all this stuff, and people are welcome to have different perspectives, obviously. But I'm gonna, as I said before, call it as I see it. The truth is, to my mind, if you want to be a real Jew, it has nothing to do with your blood and your biology. If you want to be a real Jew, as Maimonides says already in the Middle Ages, then you can't be a cruel person. Cruelty shows that you're not a descendant of Abraham in the metaphorical sense. So if you want to be a real Jew, you need to walk in the path of God, love people, be open, try and deal with people righteously, honestly, not cheat. That's what it means to be a real Jew. I don't care if you're black, yellow, green, 2 feet short or 7 feet tall, So being a real Jew is a moral, religious thing. It's not what your hair looks like look, I will say, the Jewish community nowadays in the United States is quite diverse. I think there are issues of racism. There are definitely ways that Black Jews have not been welcomed properly. A lot of funny or weird or strange things where a lot of like others in the United States, people who can't have children adopt Chinese babies and then raise them as Jews. So I think it's wonderful that Jews now in the United States are reflecting the kind of diversity that the country really is, that the country really shows. So I love the fact that Jews don't all look like whatever, like Ashkenazi Yiddish speaking Jews, but Jews look like all of humanity, Asian, African, Pacific, Oceanic, etc. I love it. That's the way Judaism, as you said before, Garfield, used to be. It was a kind of religion that was open. If you want to follow God, if you want to reject idolatry, and what does idolatry mean? It means pride arrogance, and exploitation. So if you want to reject idolatry, anyone's welcome to be a Jew. Whatever you look like, wherever you come from, that's the way it should be. So Hebrew Israelites, Black Israelites, commandment keepers, I don't care what you call yourselves, but I'm happy. Let's all be real Jews together.
Definitely. Do white Jews today consider themselves Hebrew or Israelites or both?
Well, so the terminology is interesting, and in terms of its history, I would say I think those terms mean different things in the Black community. In the first of all, for hundreds of years, 2,000 years maybe, they called themselves Jews. In the 19th century, certain reformist modernizing Jews started calling themselves Hebrews because the term Jew meant so many negative things. They didn't want to be known as Jews. And they called themselves Hebrews, right? They built temples, not synagogues, because they really wanted to fit in. They wanted to be accepted as Europeans. And they said, we're people of the Mosaic religion. Because again, they didn't want to be known as Jews. Jews had a kind of ethnic, a kind of racial sense, and there was so much anti-Semitism and condescension and denigration and mistreatment of Jews that they didn't want to be considered Jews anymore, in the sense that they wanted to change the name. Obviously, they were still, Jewish religiously and so on. Hebrews is not really a term that Jews use. I mean, yes, they're, in the 19th century, definitely, things like the Jewish equivalent of the YMCA was the YMHA, the Young Men's Hebrew Association. So definitely Jews started calling themselves Hebrews, modernizing Jews, reformist Jews, especially westernizing Jews, but it doesn't mean this. I mean, I think for Blacks, it means something else. When Blacks call themselves Hebrews or Israelites, they're trying to make that connection to ancient times. Unless I'm wrong, that they really descend from it. So the black Israelites the Hebrew Israelites of Dimona, in the Negev in Israel, that were founded by Ben Ami Carter, who came from Chicago, who was a bus driver in Chicago originally. So they call themselves the Hebrew Israelites, and so they're part of this, these different groups, these different strands, for whom I think it means something different. And I have to say, like, honestly, and this is just a personal thing, if you believe, or if you want to say you descend from the ancient Judeans, the ancient Israelites, great. So that's what you say. Will people believe you? I don't know. That's a different question. Will I fully believe that you descend from them? I'm not sure. But to me, that's not a problem. If that's meaningful to you to claim that genealogy or to insist that that's your genealogy, great. My problem is more that they say they're the only real Jews and that all the other Jews are fake Jews. That's my problem. You want to be considered Jewish also? Great, but why does that mean you have to say that all the other Jews are pretend or fake? That's insulting. It's to my mind factually nonsense. And why does it have to be either or? Why does it have to be you or me, or mutually exclusive?
Dr. Schorsch, I've reviewed a lot of documents, right? I went back to what's called the Zagat period, the Tananaim. If I mispronounce the words, family, I'm Jamaican. I'm going to use that as an excuse. It's my Jamaican accent, all right? I've looked at the Zagat period, the Tananaim period, the Amoraim period, the Savareim period, the Geonim period, the Rishonim period, and now we're living in what's called the Acharonim period, or again, my Jamaican accent is in a way. And what I find, and I spoke about this last week, is that when I look at all the Jewish communities, for some reason, they go back to Rabbi Hanasi and his arguments, or Rabbi Akiva, his debates, or if they're donating money during the Sephardic period, you see them donating to this temple in Babylonia, and it goes back to those academies. So very interested in the academies because Pum Nahara Academy or the Pum Bedieta, or all these academies from out of Babylon, or the ones in Syria, Palestine. I'm researching all of this, and I'm trying to connect folks in France, folks in Italy, folks in Germany, folks, and it seems like it goes back. I can be wrong. It's going back to Rabbi Anasi and that time period of when rabbinical Judaism started, and it evolved from the 6th century. So now we have people in the medieval writers talking about donating money, or we have to go here and so forth. And I see a Jewish community, I'm sorry, Jewish communities, plural, all over. And I'm saying to myself, these are the people who are descending from a culture after 70 AD. I can't debate you. For me to tell somebody that they're fake, I have to show and prove that it's not you. And I've come to the conclusion, even with the Babylonian Jews, I had Cornelia Wonchon. She's like an Assyriologist. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but there's this the Al Yahuda tablets. When the Jews went into Babylon, she's the one that wrote the book with Laurie Pierce and translated them.
That's amazing,
and she says to me, Garfield, I feel these Iraqi Jews been here for like 2,500 years. Exactly. And people don't realize, and I'm saying to my community, if these people went to Babylon and lived there, they didn't go back to Judea and live there, who are those people? Because they were what you would consider real Judeans, real Jews. So do you have a connection to those people? No. Can you show a continuation of culture within that those people there? Yes, we can. I read this guy's Bloom, his name is Bloom. I forgot, he's an expert on the Kittus War. He talks about the majority of the Jews living in Mesopotamia than in Jerusalem. So when the wars broke out, they were so connected as communities. I'm trying to figure out, where is the African in this? This is my problem. Where is the African in this? That we could say, hey, I could point to the African tracing back through all of this. These people have an entire history. You call it the rabbinical era. You talk about the academies. These Jews are carrying on the Torah and the living of the Torah. It expands to communities in Portugal and Spain. And then, of course, who we call the Ashkenazi, they just happen to be in another geographic location, start sleeping with those people in those cultures. So now you start getting lighter, or what we call whiter. Right. Then you have intermixing with the Sephardic. Some of those folks might be darker because you had strong African populations there in Portugal already. I mean, it's not rocket science. And I mean, your interview last week is like I had a eureka moment. Like, I've been saying this for years, and it's like you put the pieces to the puzzle together for me now, and I'm hoping the community understand. I hope they don't look at you for whatever color you are, because color messes us up. It's coming from the white man. We can't accept it. But yet still they quote your book. They'll quote your book, Dr. Schorsch, but they'll say, they'll argue, the white man this, the white man that, but they're using your book. Everybody in the community that claims to be a Black Hebrew Israelite that deals with scholarship uses your book. Your book.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, I wish they would have gotten other things out of my books. And, first of all, your summary was excellent. Excellent. I couldn't have said it better myself. As I said before, I think that one of the questions when it comes to identity is, how can you be proud of what you are? How can you love what you are without having to hate someone else, without having to put down someone else? So has there been centuries of horrible anti-Black racism? Absolutely. Centuries of white supremacy? Absolutely. Centuries of denying that Africa was valuable or that Africa had any culture? Absolutely. But nowadays, to need to boost your identity by saying we're the only real Jews and all the other Jews out there are fake, that to me is just reversing things. That's an unhealthy, dangerous way to boost your own identity, in my opinion. You want to be a Hebrew Israelite, be proud, love Hebrew Israelitism or Judaism, whatever you want to call it. Wonderful, that's great. But why do you have to deny everyone else their identity and their reality too? Again, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. There can be many diverse strands of Judaism. The African diaspora, right? Not all blacks have to be the same. They don't have to all think the same thing, be identical. God forbid. That diversity is wonderful. Diversity is lovely,
Hey, Dr. Schorsch, can I ask you a personal question? What is
Absolutely.
your view on Jesus, the Yeshua of the first century? What is your
Okay,
view on
wow.
Don't take too long. Give me a short answer so that you don't get in trouble.
Jesus, the person,
Mhm.
did he exist? Probably. Was he a great figure, wise man, prophet? Probably. Uh, Christianity that came through Paul out of Jesus has many, many incredible, wonderful aspects. As a Jew who suffered under Christian persecution for 2,000 years, not personally, obviously, I have a lot of issues with Christianity. So, Jesus's or Yeshua's teachings that are about love and being close to God, I have a lot of respect for and admire. A lot of horrible things were done in his name, unfortunately. So I don't know. Why don't I just leave it at that?
Yeah, definitely. When I think one of our disdain as a community for we used the religion that was given to us was Christianity mostly. And and by the way, that rant or whatever you guys want to call it, I just did. It's funny. I didn't get to say this part that all the Jews that I'm looking at in all these time periods, because last week I made a comment and I said, let me go back and review this information because none of these Jews believe Jesus was the Messiah. But it just
Of
so
course not.
happens the Black Hebrew Israelites believe in the New Testament. So if you descend and you say that the Sephardic Jews is you, the Sephardic Jews didn't believe in the New Testament. That's the proof that it's not you. They didn't believe that. They
Yes.
might accept that Jesus existed, but they didn't accept the New Testament at all. So when these Jews developed their organization, that's when you came and you said, Garfield, the Pentecostalism. And I'm like, yes, I read that about Wentworth. He was into that.
Right.
So when you're into Pentecostalism, you're very close to the Old Testament. So you start seeing yourself in the Old Testament. You start saying, yeah, that Exodus, we need to come out of slavery. That's our Exodus. So now you start to conform and say, hey, I am the people in the Bible. It is us. So it's inspiration. But now when you start saying, hey, internalizing it to say it's actually you, that's when you get into trouble because the Sephardic Jews you're claiming never believed in no New Testament.
Exactly. And that's what tells me that these groups are essentially syncretistic African American phenomena. The mixing of Christianity and Judaism is very typical of this kind of early 20th century religion. And not only, is it true, as you just said, that none of the Sephardim ever believed that Jesus is the Messiah, but if there were Jews in Africa, they didn't believe in Jesus either. If there were Jews in Africa, they were either kind of maybe Muslim background or of specific African peoples, backgrounds, the Igbo, again, the Ethiopians, etc. So, yeah.
That's where the question came in about the Dambriate. That's why Reggie was saying it, because all these Jews we're finding, whether they brown, whether they black, whether they white, they don't believe in the New Testament. They're a whole different culture. So what we need to find for my Hebrew Israelite brothers is find a Jewish group that believed in the New Testament and show us the records of them acknowledging it. Because I found a book, Dr. Schorsch, about the medieval Jews and the Jews under Islam. I think that's the name of it. And it talks about the economics, how you had the Nissam family or this family and that. And it's fascinating how you could relate it to modern day. Like people are arguing over who should control this route or that route and who had money. And the money came from Babylon to Morocco and it went to different cultures in the West African areas or whatever. And then you had Africans who converted, reaching out to the rabbinical scholars. That was it for me. When I found that information, that was it. I was like, that's it. I'm sold. I'm done. I know who I know who the people who's been practicing Judaism the whole time. And the fact of the matter is we're just so into color that we can't admit it, that these people, the Ashkenazi, the Sephardic, all these light-skinned people are white people, are the descendants of people who practiced Judaism from the early in the first and second century and so forth. We don't want to accept that.
Well, right. And to me, it's like, look, it's the same move that Afrocentrism makes. You know, you whites denied us, you denigrated us, you devalued us for all those centuries, and we're going to turn the tables on you. We're going to tell you that actually you're fake, you're nonsense. You know, Europe was nothing. Greece was nothing. It all came from ancient Egypt. You know, Judaism, like Yochanan ben Yochanan, and all that, those writings, Judaism was an African religion, the Ashkenazim, nonsense, again, it's just like, that's not progress. That's not moving forward. That's just moving, backward in a different way. If white supremacism sucked and was unhealthy and horrific and violent, denying other people's identities doesn't help you. I don't see how it helps you boost your identity and feel good about yourself.
Yeah. This gentleman just asked a question. We already addressed this. What about the argument of Sephardic Jews initiating the slave trade and so forth? I'm not going to go in that. Go back, my friend. Your name is your friend. So let me be your friend and tell you to go back to the last week's video and this week's video and that book I talked about, the Sephardic in the Atlantic. Read the first chapter, the foreword, the introduction, the first part, and you'll see Dr. Schorsch talking about the Sephardic rules. There's no game. Nobody's hiding anything. Even if you go to the late Eli Faber's book, Setting the Record Straight, he talks about what the Jews did. The Yahya family, that's another thing that they talked about. You weren't familiar. It's a Jewish family that lived, is recorded very well throughout history, the Yahya family. And one of them just happened to have the name Yahya Negro.
Oh, I think I know what's being referred to. Yahya, Ibn Yahya. There was a Rabbi Gedalia Ibn Yahya, I think. And there were more than that. I think there were a number of Jews who had the family name Negro, which obviously in Spanish and Portuguese means black. And I have also wondered where that name comes from. And it is totally plausible, and it would make sense to me if that name came from a family or a descendant or an ancestor who was particularly dark or black. Absolutely, sure, why not? So I don't have a problem with saying, yes, of course, there were Africans and blacks who came into the Jewish community. And yes, it's true that some Jews, had African ancestry or black ancestry and then black features. But even all of the Negro family, they were just normal Jews. They believed in Torah. They went to synagogue. They were so again, even if they have some African black ancestry, my question is still, what did it mean? Did they record anything in terms of African memories, anything in terms of a love for Africa? Did they make any statements saying blackness is beautiful and we're different than the other Jews? If you can find anything like that, wonderful. Come show me. I'll be happy to look at it and accept it. But you can't find anything like that because it just didn't exist. It's not until you get the mulatto Jews like in Suriname that you, in the 18th century, that you start to have an identity as a colored Jew. And then it's not till later in the early 20th century in the United States that you have Jews identifying as people of color, right? They're Black Jews, they're Black Hebrews, they're Hebrew Israelites, whatever you want to call them. Even the Ethiopian Jews don't focus on their Blackness because everyone around them is Black and African in Ethiopia. So it's only when they encounter white Jews in the 19th century, and it's only when they move to Israel, the state of Israel, right, that they then start to identify as Blacks and Black Jews and African Jews and Ethiopian Jews. And those are examples, the mulatto Jews in Suriname, the Black Jews in the United States, the Ethiopian Jews in Israel. Those are examples where Blackness becomes part of their identity, and it becomes meaningful, and it becomes real, you know? So if you can show me other examples from the 14th century, from the 12th century, from the 6th century, great. You know, let's talk.
Yeah. Brother Amin-Ra McCarthy, what I'm gonna do is, after I pick up my son, I'm gonna go live because he wants to vent, and he feels that just constantly taking everything away from us. Sad. So him being a Jew, I want to claim. Listen, family, y'all, everybody knows my opinion on this already. I'm not a culture vulture. I'm not trying to be what I am not. I would be a Jew though, because to be a Jew, I could convert. I could follow the rules and the laws of the Torah. I don't have a problem with the laws. So I could convert, but at least I know where I stand as far as I'm following a culture. It's no problem. I'm a convert. Just like becoming a Christian. You're converting to Christianity. You decide to say, Ashalullah, there's no God but Allah, and you take your Shahada and you become a Muslim. You have converted to that way of life. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. And this is the point. Dr. Schorsch, he's lucky he didn't pull out the daggers, because if he decided to say, hey, Garfield, I'm gonna do a show on my genealogy and show some people from my past and start going backwards, I might lose all my membership to the Dagger Squad, because that is the problem. We can show Jews who follow New Testament. That's the first thing. We can't show Jews coming off the slave ship saying, hey, I'm a Jew and I'm a slave. You can't show it. You can't. Then you say this, you are the Sephardic Jews, but yet still the Sephardic Jews are enslaving the same Africans. So who are you? Are you the slave that's fulfilling prophecy? Or are you the guy that's actually orchestrating a part of the slave trade? Make up your mind, people. If you want truth, hey, I tell people all the time, Dr. Short, make up your own religion. Nobody can say you copy. Make up your own religion. And if you do follow religion or culture, keep it to yourself. I don't want to know. Keep it to yourself. But when you use your system of belief to try to downtrodden somebody else and talk negative and beat somebody down just to say I'm more superior, then you're having a problem, because people start investigating what you're saying and show how narrow-minded your thinking is and how you're incorrect when it comes to history and archaeology. Show me a Jew that was worshiping and followed the New Testament. Show me a Jew that came off the slave ship and said, hey, I've worshiped Yahweh and I'm a slave today. You can't do it because it's not there. We can't find it. Yeah. We can't. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to call it a day. Dr. Schorsch, I'll probably hit you up later. We have a conversation. I really accept a lot of the things you said. I don't have any disagreements. Some people might not like the way you say things. I mean, nobody's going to love everybody 100%, you know, but I appreciate you not only taking your time last week, but also this week. And I want to say thank you. And hopefully in the future, we'll have another I wish I could have you on every day if it's up to me, because what you solve, the Sephardic, the Marranos, the new Christians, this is their last straw, Dr. Schorsch. I'm going to be the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi is the devil. You know, you are the last straw they're holding on to. So now you have you're on the dagger squad, you have completely daggered them because you are the writer of the book they like to quote.
Right.
So this is the final straw right here, ladies and gentlemen. And by the way, in 2 weeks, I'm doing an interview with a Russian, all the way from Russia, about the Russian icons, because the Black Hebrew Israelites claim that the Russian icons is them, and those dark colored people is them, and they're the real color of the Israelites, and that's how Jesus really looked, and all this craziness. So I decided to invite an expert on Russian icons to come on, just like how you are expert on the Sephardic stuff, and this guy is going to come on, and I have a translator, so he's speaking Russian all the way from Russia to us here in America to explain the Russian icons and the history of it. So
Awesome.
that's going to be next 2 weeks, and then later this afternoon around 2:40, I'm going to come back live. I want to talk to that brother, whatever his name is, so we could have a conversation.
All right. You send it my way.
Today.
You
All
send
right?
it my way
Thank
afterward.
you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Man.
Thanks for inviting me.
You're an excellent teacher. You're an excellent teacher. You made it plain.
As Abraham said in the Bible, Baruch mivarcheni. May the one who blessed me be blessed. So listen, thanks for thinking of me. Thanks for inviting me. I'm honored. Yeah, be happy to talk in the future.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Be well. Everyone should be well. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen.